This is Speaking of Shakespeare, conversations about things Shakespearean. I'm Thomas Dabbs, broadcasting from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. If you are joining us on YouTube and wish to listen to this program as a podcast, you may click the link below to your favorite podcast platform. This talk is with David Sterling Brown, who is currently a Mellon ACLS Scholars and Society Fellow. David is an alumnus of Trinity College in Connecticut and New York University. He is a member of the Race Before Race Conference Series Executive Board. He also serves on the editorial boards for Shakespeare Survey and Shakespeare Bulletin. He specializes, among other things, on race in Shakespeare and on the connections between the African-American experience in relation to the history of Shakespearean production. This series is funded with institutional support from Aoyama Gakuin University and also with a generous grant from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. David, it is so good to finally have a chance to meet you. We've been communicating for maybe a couple of months, so thank you so much for joining us here. What I wanted to do is get right off the bat. I wanted to go to what you're currently doing because there's some extremely interesting involvement that you're having. I wouldn't say it's non-scholarly, but you're getting very much active in the dramaturgy, dramatic arts as a ACLS, and now for our international audience, that's the American Council of Learned Societies, very prestigious grant. And this is an ACLS Mellon Scholars program, and you're a society fellow right now. And you have just been involved with some activity, I'll let you explain, but the Racial Imaginary Institute, the acronym is TRII, founded by Claudia Rankine. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Rankine?
Yes.
Yes. And your recent involvement with the actor Keith Hamilton Cobb. So if you could bring us up to date on what's just happened in your life, very exciting stuff.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and hello to everyone out there that's watching. So yes, I am currently a 2021 ACLS Mellon Scholars and Society Fellow. And it's an ACLS Mellon Fellowship. And essentially, this is a public engagement initiative that they're running. There are 12 fellows, and it's an opportunity for me to take my Shakespeare and race scholarship and try to do something new and exciting and interesting with it that appeals to the broader public. So with this fellowship, I have a residency with the Racial Imaginary Institute, which was founded by author, poet, essayist, NYU professor Claudia Rankine. And I am just really enjoying the time that I'm spending so far with the Racial Imaginary Institute. I guess I should pause there or slow down and just explain what TRII is. Yes, the acronym is TRII, and in-house we say TRI, I learned. And so it's an interdisciplinary think tank, as they describe it on the website. It's non-hierarchical, so there's a curatorial team of people that I'm working with that includes Claudia Rankine, her husband, John Lucas, psychoanalyst, poet, playwright, you name it, pretty much. There's a smorgasbord of people right now working toward their 2022 initiative, which is on nationalism. So there's going to be a symposium on nationalism and a bunch of events happening later. But their mission is essentially that no sort of sphere of life is left untouched by race. And to me, when I learned about the Institute from my Binghamton colleague, Jennifer Stover, who's also a close collaborator, I was like, aha, like, that's the place I want to be. And so I am so grateful that this opportunity worked out. And I'm happy to say more about my involvement with them, but I don't want to lecture you. I don't know if you have any specific questions.
No, you can lecture me, because I really am interested in what you've recently finished a process of, is it reading Othello? And there's that, and I'm not sure if it's connected directly with TRII, or you're collaborating that in some way. But I do
Yeah.
want to get to the Keith Hamilton Cobb
Oh, yeah.
project, and also, but anything else that you would like to say about TRII? Maybe those are two separate things.
Yeah, they are. They are, but they're merging. And
okay,
I love that about it. So, because this Scholars in Society Fellowship, it's been an enormous blessing that has just allowed me the time to work with creative people and people who are outside of my field, outside of Shakespeare studies, people who care about race. And it is blowing my mind, the things that I'm learning, the things that I'm doing. So for example, with TRII, we meet every Sunday. We have operations meetings to plan for all of the events that are going to be happening next year, including a symposium that I'm going to be spearheading, which I'll say a little bit about that. And we also are, doing things like scouting spaces. I'm learning that that's something that they have to do as they plan these events, which is really cool and interesting. They work with a lot of different art galleries and things of that nature. So I have branched out of my sort of comfort zone this year. I've actually been spending quite a bit of time in art gallery spaces, just looking and trying to learn about that whole world and the process of curating art exhibitions and things of that nature, because that is actually going to be an outcome of my fellowship as well. And so it's been an honor, of course. I assume most people know who Claudia Rankine is. If you don't, I have her book here, one of them actually, Just Us, An American Conversation. And the reason why I held that up is both because it's a phenomenal text, but also it's inspired the work that I'm doing with the Racial Imaginary Institute. So I am planning a symposium for 2022. This symposium intersects my scholarship with Claudia's work and the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, his 1903 text, The Souls of Black Folk, and then Shakespeare. So a broad sort of arc of literary folks there that I'm engaging with, and scholarship as well, to think about specifically racialized whiteness. So Hamlet and Othello are going to be the plays that I center as we are inspired by Claudia's work and thinking about crafting a conversation.
Yes, excellent. I want to return to racialized whiteness and perhaps to some, again, to the work that you're currently doing with TRII. And but I don't want to miss the Keith Hamilton Cobb a bit. So Keith Hamilton Cobb, for those who don't know, is the author of American Moor, a play, a delightful play. I got to get through it. It's and there's some clips on YouTube, and one of them is really kind of very funny. He has a very good stage presence, kind of comic, but then also tragic, or there's pathos in the, of course, in the production. But if you, he's famously that, and also an actor of known actor. And you have done Untitled Othello, and I'm very interested in hearing what the results were with that process and what you did and how that was done.
Yeah, and I'm glad you used the word process, because that's exactly how Keith describes it on the Untitled Othello website. And the reason why I said these things are all connected is that I am interested, as I have this public engagement fellowship, in doing things that allow for public engagement. And so when Keith approached me about being, a part of the Untitled Othello process, I thought, well, this is great, because one, I am steeped in my own book project writing right now, and Othello is a part of that. So I was like, this is a great way to immerse myself in the play, in the text, in different ways, from a different angle. But also Keith, I've asked him to be involved with my symposium with TRII, with the Racial Imaginary Institute. So that's what I meant when I said all of these things are working together. And so it was a no-brainer to join Keith and his ensemble for this initiative. And essentially with Untitled Othello, Keith is very interested in exploring the play from a new angle and really getting at the heart of what Shakespeare was up to and why this play matters, why it's relevant right now for us. And it is a difficult play. You know, we spent 80 hours over 2 weeks discussing the play, only getting up to Act 2, by the way, because the conversations that were generated were rich. They were moving, they were difficult. We had some very difficult moments, you know, for folks who watched, they got to see raw responses to what this play does. And it was very exhausting.
Well, who were the players? I saw a picture of people sitting around the table, and who were the other players? It's you and Keith and who else? Yeah.
So Jessica Burr is the artistic director, and she has a company called The Blessed Unrest. And then there were about, I think, 10 other actors in the room. So not every character was covered. And I only know first names, unfortunately, but now I'm going around the room in my head mentally. So there was Rob, there was Zach, and Terrell, and Heather, and Aaron, Sarah, and Michael, and I'm almost there. Michael, and Stephanie.
Okay, yeah. So you're reading lines from the play and then pausing to discuss how they resonate? Is that how it's going on?
No, this was a lot more in depth than that, actually. So Keith brought me in specifically to sort of use my scholarly expertise to inform what he wants the actors to be doing and thinking about as they think through their lines and as this play gets potentially performed and staged. And so we started out with just general conversations about the play, and then we got into actually looking at the play from start to finish. So we started with Act 1, Scene 1, for instance, and Keith had, you know, the actors play their roles, or read their roles, you know, and then we'd stop and we'd pause and we'd interrogate the moments to think about what's going on with the characters. What does this scene look like? Where are we? What's Iago's motivation for saying the things that he says? And you know, my job, I quickly became, I guess, bad cop. I didn't really see it that way, but it was my job to sort of rein in the conversation so that we were not ignoring the racial implications of everything that was being said in the play. And that was really hard. It produced, because you're talking about a room that had so Keith, myself, and then Montano, who was Terrell, and Othello, who was Rob. So 4 Black men, and then the rest are white actors. And a lot of them, most of them, maybe all of them actually, had to be honest about their lack of engagement with and their lack of knowledge with respect to race and racism, because it's something they don't have to really think about as white people in a society that is built for white people. Mm-hmm. So it was challenging. It was so challenging when you talk about the emotions that Keith puts into his writing, for instance, in American Moor. All of that was coming out because, you know, that play is, which I also have that here. And I got Keith actually signed it. I haven't read what he wrote yet, by the way. I'm just waiting until I have the right mindset so that I can really absorb and internalize what he said. But this play, as you said, it challenges you and it pushes you to think about issues. It's a hard play, both in terms of the language that Keith uses to articulate the difficulties of being a Black actor in a theatrical world that caters to and centers whiteness. So it's just him and the director character in this play, but the tension between the two of them really resonates with the audience and produces what I like to think of as productive discomfort.
Very good word, productive discomfort, sort of unsettling. Well, I think that's an important point, because if you take, there's several stages of this whiteness thing. There's the Shakespearean period itself, then there's a reception, and the whole era of blackface, and which may be continuing in some places, and then more progressive liberal and more white liberals. Okay, well, wait a second. Let's try to understand this othered person, right, from the very beginning of the play. And then you're talking about coming in from a perspective where in your life you have known being othered, and the identification you have with the hero here, and to watch him degenerate and watch his psychology, and then relate to him in ways that other people may not, because they're looking from the other side. So I think that might have been a point of conflict, maybe in.
That was a point of, yes, that was a point of conflict, but even more so than that. And that was, it took me days to get the white actors in the room to realize and understand this point, was that Othello should, in my mind, should be just as hard for white folks to grapple with as it is for Black folks to grapple with. And so when the actors finally realized that point, that's when it became really, really hard, because they were, some of them were even having dreams about this process and what racism does to white people, the perpetuation of it. And what does it mean, and what does it take for a figure like Iago to be the way he is, and say the things that he says, and do the things that he does? When we started isolating that, instead of always doing what happens in the majority of productions that focus on this play, which is to center the focus on the Black actor and Othello's tragic, nature, and the tragedy there. Racism is tragic for everyone. It impacts us differently. And I talked about this a little bit in a lot, in a piece I wrote for Los Angeles Review of Books earlier this summer, but it's tragic for everybody. Nobody really wins. It looks like it on the surface, but
yeah, well, there's that moment in the, now I think revived, but famous James Baldwin. We'll get more to Baldwin later, but James Baldwin's debate with Buckley. Yeah,
love that.
At the Cambridge Union, and that wonderful YouTube piece that has preserved it. But he makes this point. He says, the white sheriff in Mississippi, I'm not sure what example, but he says this guy is a perfectly fine person, right? Otherwise, he's just like any of us. But then he has, I guess, to carry this burden, this psychic burden of his racism. He has to maintain it, right?
Yes.
And to get back to Othello, there is an argument, and I see how you could say Iago could have been good, but this, I don't want to use an overword, the systemic racism, what he has to believe to be Iago is what drives the evil that comes from him. So he isn't just born evil. And the source of that evil is racism.
Yeah. And
he has to maintain in order to be Iago.
Yes, I love that you talk about and just mentioned that phrase, systemic racism, because we spend a lot of time talking about that with the entire Untitled Othello cast. And actually, there were students involved too with that, which I can say a little bit about as well. But that's what we're looking at in that play, right? Is a system in which all of these characters are operating, and every single one of them is complicit in some way in the racism that gets directed toward Othello, even Desdemona. And that was something, when we had the actress in the room, Stephanie, sit and think about her complicity. it was just mind-blowing to see her theatrical process unfold all of these realizations about how even her as wife to this titular character, simply by even just referring to him as the Moor, right, shows on some level her complicity with this system, whether or not she won. And that's something we spent time thinking about, and so Keith paused, and we had Desdemona, the actress, play it in different ways. And she ultimately settled on saying the term in a way that showed how she was interested in sort of appeasing her white male audience in that scene in Act One, but also showing and demonstrating some resistance to having to do that to her Black husband. But if she doesn't resist fully, right, then that still implicates her in the racism, because to refer to this character who has a name, Othello, as the Moor, it's dehumanizing, and it takes away his humanity and reduces him to only part of what he is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's right there from the very beginning. I think that if just one more comment about systemic racism, why it might be irritating to let's say the majority class, the white class, or whatever, because there are a lot of different types of white people, a lot of different types of Black people, whatever. But the system itself is invisible. Very often, it's completely invisible. You don't see it, so you don't know why it's operating somehow in your psyche, right? And not necessarily with violence, not necessarily with what Brabantio's almost violent outrage that his daughter has married a Black man, right?
Right. And I would even say, that violence, it doesn't have to be overt, right? It can be covert, and it can be psychological, it can be emotional. And that was something that we also realized as we were thinking about this play, because so much of what happens to Othello is verbal, or what happens, at least for the audience, in terms of their understanding of how the racism is operating in the play. It happens through language, right? That was a deliberate choice to refer to him as the Moor, as opposed to the general. He could be referred to as the general, but he's not. And so we have to think about what is that word really doing? And why isn't Cassio, for instance, referred to as throughout the play as the Florentine, right?
Yeah. It's amazing to me how that play is so current. Of course, it's current always in the human condition. The theme of jealousy is always something that people deal with, but this race theme is so current. Let's say the NBA star that would grace you with his presence, right, who you would want to invite into your home for dinner and ask him about his adventures on the court or whatnot, and then he decides to marry your daughter, right?
Well,
right now, that's a thing.
It's a thing, and we talked about that. The example. I'm not a sports person, so I'm limited here in the conversation I could have with you. But we talked about that. It came up several times, with athletes and Black male athletes, and particularly the NFL and all the challenges that they've had with respect to thinking about the players as players versus the players as people, and people who have emotional and psychological responses and even physical responses to the systemically racist issues that happen for Black people and Black lives. And so that is not so far-fetched to think about what you just said, and here we are. I don't even, when all of this thing started, people used to be like, it's 2020, for God's sakes, why, this is still happening. As you just said, and I think that rightly so, this issue that we have to grapple with, racism, it's invisible, it's omnipresent. A lot of times I like to refer to it or think about it as Prospero's magic, right? We don't see it, but things happen. And sometimes they're small, sometimes they're big, but things happen for a reason. And then there are these outcomes and consequences because of whatever is operating in time and space. The other thing I would say, just as you were talking too, what also rather made the time challenging with the Untitled Othello, but challenging in the most productive way. And so when I talk about it as or challenging and exhausting, I'm saying that with the greatest amount of love and admiration that I could have for the process, because it was life-changing.
Yeah.
And I mean that sincerely, but misogyny is another through line in that play. And we had to grapple with that big time.
Yeah. Yeah, because then you're getting into gender issues and into another history of gendered abuse and that sort of thing. What has always interested me about the opening act is how Othello is completely unaffected by Brabantio's accusations. That doesn't touch him. He's known hard times. He's been a slave. We find out later. He has been in battles. He has spent his entire life battling. So this kind of direct challenge does not bother him at all. But what eats at him is the distrust of his new wife and also his good, gentle Iago, right? Because there's a moment there where he has to doubt Iago, that's what drives him crazy, or whatever.
See, and this is why we got so caught up. Literally, I think we probably spent at least 2 days just on Act 1, Scene 1, because you just said something that triggered a memory for me. Good Iago, or as I think he's referred to in the play as Good Iago, but more than that, he's referred to as Honest Iago.
Honest Iago, yeah.
And we paused and we thought about that. Well, and I, from my, pre-modern critical race studies perspective, was able to sort of discuss with them, well, what is that doing when you have the most vile character in the play being referred to as Honest Iago by pretty much everyone? What is that doing? And we, talked about, I brought in, for instance, Hortense Spiller's sort of thinking there, where she talks about the power of rhetoric and descriptive discourse, and how rhetoric and language, and this is in Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, rhetoric and descriptive discourse has the power to sort of control our thinking about things, right? And so Honest Iago, and he's Honest Iago even as he hurls these racial slurs and racist slurs at Othello's sort of presence or being at the beginning of the play. And he's Honest Iago even as he manipulates other people. And it really, that's something that I take on, the sort of paradox or contradictory nature of that language versus the actions. It's something I take on in a forthcoming essay that will appear in Arthur Little's volume, White People in Shakespeare, which I focus on Antony and Cleopatra there, because you actually see something very similar happening with the language directed at a white figure or the concept of whiteness being used in a way that actually undermines itself.
Cleopatra is another interesting case, and let's pursue that. And she's Egyptian, right?
Yeah.
And there's a play. I do some work on lost plays, particularly before Shakespeare, and there were several feminine heroes. I don't think you're supposed to use the word heroines, but that's what they're called at that time. And one of them is the Queen of Ethiopia. And in the narrative, she's magically turned white. And there's a magic trick so that, and that doesn't go to the Elizabethan state. That was in the narrative before it was adopted. And we don't know the play, and we don't know but the Cleopatra, what's going on there?
A lot. So this is issue in the play, which it reminds me of Ian Smith and Othello's Black Handkerchief. It's an article that he had published in Shakespeare Quarterly several years back. And he paused on the moment, and I'm saying this because of a conversation I had with him where he just kind of explained to me like why this became interesting to him and why this article was born out of it. There's a line in Othello where it talks about the handkerchief being dyed in mummy, and mummy is a very dark substance, but yet we have for centuries been under the impression that this handkerchief is white. And so the title of Smith's article is Othello's Black Handkerchief. And so I had a similar moment of pause in Antony and Cleopatra, because there's Titus, who's a Roman messenger of Caesar's. It comes in, it's in the middle of the play, he's in Egypt, and he is, I believe, touching Cleopatra's hand. Antony gets wind of this and it incenses him. And he actually refers to Cleopatra's hand as a quote unquote white hand. And he tells Titus basically that, in the future, whenever he sees even just sees the hand of a white hand, never mind touches it, but he should shake thou to look on it. And I thought, whoa, this is so fascinating, because we have, and there's been this historical and scholarly tensions about, is Cleopatra Black? Is she white? I'm not interested or invested in that. I'm interested in how Shakespeare depicted her. And in his play, she's tawny, right? She is referred to as Black as well. I believe it's Phoebus's Pinch's Black is the line. And so I thought, whoa, what's happening here? And it's kind of similar to the Ian Smith moment. You pause on it, you start to interrogate it, and I realized that a lot's going on in terms of this notion of white property, a lot's going on in terms of white patriarchal power in this moment that I see as a color conversion, because Cleopatra is not Antony's wife, she's his illicit lover, he's a married man, but in order for her to become something that is worth protecting, he makes this move to whiten her, which I thought was so interesting. And then I won't give everything away about the article or the essay. It's coming out next year, soon, I should say. But there was also another realization for me about what work that white hand notion could possibly be doing. And actually, now I'm going to ask you to humor me. Could you hold up the palm side of your hand? Okay. Looks very similar to mine. This side, not so much, but but so there's something else going on there in that moment. And I just, I had to pause on it, think about it, write about it. So that's what I did.
It's interesting. There's a story I have about the palm of the hand from my childhood. But,
oh, really?
Yeah, let's stay on track here, because
no, it's like you can't tell it. Like, I hate when people do that. They're like, I have a story, but wait, I'll tell you tomorrow.
I had a Black babysitter, and it's one of my earliest memories. I may be 5 years old, and I would say, your hand on the backside is colored, but inside is white. You're not colored. And she said, white's a color too. And
yes.
So that's a deep memory of mine. I grew up in the American South, and there are a lot of things that just are, these kind of not horrible memories. I had wonderful parenting and so forth, but the society we were in, you talk about systemic, but I didn't want to get too much into that. That's a long history.
Oh yeah, no, but that was enough for me to latch onto something there, which is to say, she's right, and the other thing that is so interesting to me in just thinking, it's a very simple statement, white is a color too, but a lot of people actually don't think of, still to this day, don't think about whiteness in relationship to race, for instance, unless you have the presence of Blackness, and so to me, this statement of whiteness, or white is a color too, it moves me in the direction of thinking about the invisibility of whiteness in our society, both American society, but then even globally. as well. I'm just curious, actually, too. So where'd you grow up in the South?
I grew up in a country crossroads outside of Sumter, South Carolina, about 12 miles outside of town, and about
Okay.
8 miles from the nearest post office.
I just got really excited because that's where my roots are from.
Oh, really?
Not Sumter, but South Carolina. Yeah. My family is from Gaffney.
From Gaffney, yeah.
My mother was born in.
It's more upstate, but we were in there was the Deep South and the slow changes in the Deep South, and then there were pockets within the Deep South, small towns, and then there was the countryside, which was a pocket inside of a pocket. So I remember, David, Black Night at the fair, at the county fair, and thinking about how strange that was. And to, of course, my father, it wasn't strange. It just was the way things were. It's part of the system.
Yeah.
I remember Dr. Levi's office and not even seeing it, because you go into the waiting room, you wait, and then you go to your car and leave. But I turned around and looked, and I noticed that there were a number of Black people in another room. He had segregated waiting rooms. And I found that the hottest thing. And the school I went to the 6th grade was all white, and there was the all Black school. And both Blacks and white were happy to have schools, I guess, in that next generation. You know, they built schools, but they were completely segregated. And then within a year and a half, completely desegregated. So that was kind of forced on my generation to deal with without any manual. And also the Black kids who came in without any manual. And of course, you had all of the whole spectrum of racism on the white side. You had whatever you had, but that was just kind of thrown at us to deal with. And it's amazing to me how quickly we adapted.
Yeah, it's so my grandmother, was my mother's mother, maternal grandmother, was born and raised in South Carolina. And then my father's mother was born in Mississippi, but in the Jim Crow era. And so that history is not far removed at all from, it's only really a generation. Between my grandmother and I. My grandmother's one is 83 and one is 86, but it is so fascinating to me. I was just in South Carolina last month, actually, at my grandmother's, and to think that I, as this Shakespeare professor person, am part of her lineage, which involved her having to walk to school because there were no buses for the Black kids in Gaffney. And to now she lives probably about 3/4 of a mile from where her school was. And she has a house. It's mind-blowing and very moving to think that, yes, there's been progress, that there's no doubt about that. But there has also been and continues to be challenges along those racial lines. But and I want to say something about segregation when we come back, because it's related to the, or not when we come back. I'm like, is there a commercial break here? We had breaks in, I think I'm still in Untitled Othello mode. We had breaks last week.
We've gotten no offers. Advertisers.
So we'd come back to things, but segregation is actually very much tied to an article that I published last year, but within our field. It was called Hood Feminism. And so I'd love to maybe come back to that topic.
We will. It's on our list. And coming from the East, you can be in Texas a long time before you get to El Paso, right? And the idea of progress, right? If El Paso were your goal, right? We're still not at it. We haven't reached El Paso yet, but we've gotten somewhere through this enormous process of so many people having to go through transformations, and it's a tough road for a society, for democracy to take on. And there have been some successes, and there's still some failures. But I did want to move into the connections that I saw when I was a young graduate student, and I was studying. I was studying Shakespeare, but I was also reading African American literature, because it's so good. I mean, just plainly, when you get into Ralph Ellison, the power in there. I immediately related it to Shakespeare, and I came across the James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time and his other essays, and I was as this Southern white male young guy, I was so moved by those essays. I mean, they moved me. And you know how we are. We're in a profession. So we tend to read as professional literary scholars and so forth. And with Baldwin, it's just, no, I'm just going to sit back and you have found connections between Baldwin and Shakespeare. And I'm eager to find out what those connections are and if they're similar or if there's some new ones for me.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and I'm not the first or the only one to think about those connections. But Baldwin has an essay that he wrote, I think it was in the 1960s, called "Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare." And so, have you read that before?
Yeah, in another century.
Oh, oh, right, yeah. And so there's that connection, but then. I created this course at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut in 2013 called Early Modern Literature Crossing the Color Line. And I just thought then, as I was developing the course, I went to NYU for grad school. My minor field was African-American literature. And of course, I'm an early modernist, my major field in Shakespeare studies. And as I was studying for my exams and reading the work of African-American authors, I kept seeing allusions to Shakespeare. And I'm like, what's going on here? And that just spiraled into a fascination with wanting to put those things together. So in a course that I teach, the Early Modern Literature Crossing the Color Line class, Baldwin's Giovanni's Room is actually a major part of that course in a unit that I have called Sexuality and the Paradox of Passing. And I'm really fascinated by Baldwin, not just because he's super smart, and also the way that he writes is profoundly moving, and it is incredibly deep. And I mean, I think we could probably do a session right now just on talking about one of his texts, even if it's like Sonny's Blues or something, and yes. For me, it beyond the illusions, though, I was starting to think like, okay, what's going on with these African American authors? Like W.E. Du Bois, also in The Souls of Black Folk, alludes to Shakespeare, and I realized that in addition to putting their own sort of artistic genius next to and engaging with his, they're also setting themselves apart from Shakespeare and the canon and this history, whether it's the dramatic history that we see with respect to whiteness, or even just the history in terms of thinking about Shakespeare as this like great thinker, right? There's a lot of people who are in that bardolatry camp. And so Shakespeare, there will never be anyone greater than Shakespeare, so, and
perfectly post facto reshaping, and so much is lost in that history. So much is lost, and we rely on creative types and the great writers to come back and read and bring in their perspective from another era and to relearn Shakespeare in that way.
Yeah, relearn. And one of the key words that kept coming up with Untitled Othello was unlearn, right? Because so much of what we get pedagogically, and I'm using that term broadly, but I'm thinking mainly about the US context here, although I've had conversations with people who live in like the UK, et cetera, and it is similar, the narratives, right? That Shakespeare, greatest dramatist that ever lived. Like go on the street or go to the mall and ask somebody, who's the greatest dramatist that ever lived? And probably you're gonna hear from somebody, Shakespeare. And so, yeah, this rather than setting him apart, I think including Shakespeare in this constellation of great people, because you don't need to have over 30 plays written and poems to necessarily be great or even the greatest. And I mean, I am so inspired by Shakespeare's work and moved by it, that's for sure. That's why I do what I do, and I love what I do. But I'm also deeply invested in challenging some of the aspects of the work, right? Because you look at a play like Titus Andronicus, which is my favorite Shakespeare play. And I only figured out recently, like, why it's my favorite Shakespeare play, because so many people think I'm crazy I've said this so many times, but that many people think, like, why are you like this play with violence? Just from start to finish, it's just violence, violence, violence. And I realized that that play is not so far, and I mean, I don't mean that people in the place where I grew up were baking children into pies. That wasn't happening. But I grew up in a low-income community in this country. And in the late 80s, early 1990s, you're talking about the crack epidemic and gang violence and turf wars. And I saw things. I was aware of things as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, that most people, if they can, they try to shield their children from knowing what death is and what funerals are. That wasn't my world. And so when Titus begins and you realize that he's buried 20 plus sons, right? It's like, I know what I've seen it. I've seen my grandfather have to bury a child. So in that sense, I identify with young Lucius, and that didn't occur to me until a few months ago. It's not just about it being a tragedy, but it's about the way that it speaks to the world that I knew, but also the world that we live in. I mean, look at what's happening in malls and schools, et cetera. Still, since Columbine, it is disheartening, it's frustrating, it's saddening, it's sickening. I could go on there. And so it's not that I find comfort in a play like Titus, but there's a familiarity there that I think resonates more with the realities of the world in which we live than, say, a play like Much Ado About Nothing, right? Like, we are not all out in the streets singing "Hey Nani Nani," especially in this pandemic.
No, we are not. But I do like that there is space for comedy. If we're going to that space. When I first started teaching, it seems like any anthology, usually an intro to lit class, and that was a big deal to get that because we were teaching some freshman comp and that kind of thing. And we had an anthology of drama, and there wasn't one drama in there. It was more modern that had a happy ending. It was all, and there's some great things. There's Eugene O'Neill, there's a Hansberry, there's of course Arthur Miller and so forth. But I told my students last year during the when we were in the thick of the pandemic, saying I'm not going to do Hamlet anymore. I'm too old for it, and it's beginning to really mean too much. I think we're just going to go with Much Ado or something like that. But you're exactly right. This relates back to what we were talking about earlier, how you come in from your perspective in your childhood, which began a few years after my childhood. I come in.
Hey, we're both last century babies.
We're both last century babies. Yeah, we can claim that. But I grew up where I grew up. You grew up where you grew up. And when we come to Titus, all right, we're going to bring in two different things. Now, the problem is that the dominant interpretation tends to belong to the dominant class, or historically in education, and how it's taught, how it's framed, how it's presented. And I think what you and Keith and all the people who are working on this is saying, listen, let's bring something else in here. And let's maybe unlearn some things that we really didn't need to learn, that may not even be part of this play, right?
Yeah, that's a really great point. Yes.
Yeah. And so I'm you were talking about the conflict. This thing you don't reach these revelations through a primrose path. It is more the steep and thorny way. I think it's Ophelia, and it's hard.
It's hard, and we're on the same wavelength here. Get out of my head. That's what I was just going to say, is that I had to last week and the week before remind the actors in the ensemble that this work that we're doing is hard. And I think the only reason why, because I think many people at various times probably want to get up and just jump out the window, seriously, because like there were tears from, and not just, it was across gender lines. There were tears, there were strong emotions being released in the room, outside of the room, because, you know, we'd go on break and the cameras would be off and people would just kind of, because it's hard. We were in it for 7 hours a day, just sitting in that. And even though we had those 10-minute breaks and the hour lunch break, we stayed in it. So it is hard. It is very hard. And I think, though, I would push back just a little bit and say that if you really allow yourself to get into the nitty-gritty of Much Ado About Nothing, for instance, or a dark comedy like The Merchant of Venice, you can find moments there where it maybe, again, like not Titus, it's not from start to finish, but moments that are really disturbing. Like when Leonato essentially disowns Hero because he thinks that she has cheated on Claudio, and he says all kinds of vile things to her. And for us in our modern world, that traffics in the realm of verbal domestic abuse, for instance.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, you've got the physical domestic abuse in Othello. And so that was another conversation that we had to have last week.
Oh, yeah, I should have added that. When I went to comedy this past semester, I realized, well, you know, they're dark too. They have themes that tug at you. Malvolio in Twelfth Night, he's just way over punished. And Shylock seems, you know, over punished. And there are, you know, these are supposed to be lighter, easier on us than Titus. But
right.
But there is, you know, why is Don John evil? What made him evil? And his bastardry, which is another thing that you could bring right into the American landscape in terms of race and, you know,
family construction. Yeah, there's so much going on there.
Have we developed a kind of definition of racialized whiteness, or is there more there that you would like to go into? Racialized whiteness as an interesting, it brings up my spell checker.
Well,
wants to change it to radicalized instead of racialized.
I was like, this is actually good because I wanted a segue somehow. So I'm glad that you are bringing up racialized whiteness, and I'm just going to write that down so that I have a marker there, because I don't want to forget what I want to say in response to that. But I wanted to pause because I don't know, perhaps you probably heard by now that Bell Hooks passed away. And oh, you're just learning that for the first time?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm sorry to be the one to deliver that really sad, unfortunate news. Yes, she passed away earlier today. And I wanted to, because her work has been so influential to so many people. And just, you know, she's a model in many ways in terms of the way that she thinks, the way that she theorizes. I had a really, really great privilege when I was working at the University of Arizona to meet her and introduce my parents to her, which to me was just a profound moment because, you know, I'm a former first generation college student, the first person in my family to get a PhD, and to think that the things that I've done allowed us to have that moment, and the things that my parents did that supported me. And so I was wondering if you would just indulge me and allow me to read and share something from Bell Hooks's book,
Yes.
Black Looks,
Yes.
Race and Representation, because it pertains to this question that you've just asked about racialized whiteness. So she's talking about the struggle for sort of getting out of where we are. And she says, the struggle needs to include non-Black allies as well. Images of race and representation have become a contemporary obsession. Commodification of Blackness has created a social context where appropriation by non-Black people of the Black image knows no boundaries. if the many non-Black people who produce images or critical narratives about Blackness and Black people do not interrogate their perspective, then they may simply recreate the imperial gaze, the look that seeks to dominate, subjugate, and colonize. This is especially so for white people looking at and talking about Blackness. And I wanted to bring that in, one, as of course a tribute to this phenomenal Black woman who, again, has shaped and probably, it's without question will continue to shape so many minds. But that to me gets at the heart of what our struggles were with the tensions in the room with the Untitled Othello project, because Shakespeare built this really, really difficult, complex, but smartly done play that doesn't allow us to get away from the indictments of whiteness and white supremacy that are necessary in order to understand what's really going on in that play, and what leads this prominent Black character, who is respected as a general, but not necessarily as a total human being, what leads him to kill himself. And the resistance to his Blackness, the racism in that structure in the play really supplies the answer. So I just wanted to offer that. And I'm sorry that I had to be the one to inform you about that.
Well, no, that's, we're not going to, going back to Anthony, I'm not going to punish the messenger, but what a fine writer and thinker, and who spoke to us from the heart.
Yeah. And from her heart, right? Like,
yeah.
I saw a tweet today and someone mentioned how she's a model, I'm paraphrasing, but of doing the kind of work that she did, not for popularity, but simply because of her integrity. Yeah. And I think there's so much to learn from her path and the way that she moved for many, and if not all.
Yeah. I'm interested in what she began with, which echoes really sentiment from, of course, from King and from Baldwin, but there somehow to get this resolved, and I've thought about this a lot lately, of course, since George Floyd, but going back to even well before, we can go back forever, but there has to be some kind of path to redemption in the white world, because people begin seeing things and they start getting very nervous and very apologetic, and it just doesn't seem to make things better. Yeah. We have to determine, which they never did quite get it straight in the Bible, but just how much we're going to hold people to the sins of the fathers, and resolve these very basic elemental issues as a path to solve some of these problems that continue, right? And that's what I see in Bell Hook, and also in the writings of Baldwin, King, and others, that there's a path to redemption. And I'm not speaking about Christianity in particular, but I'm using a Christian model.
Yeah, I hope there's a path to redemption. As I said during the Untitled Othello process, there may be a time when we don't have to live in this kind of world. My grandmothers, as I said, are 83 and 86. This is all they've known. This is all they've known. And I'm fairly certain it will be all I will ever know. And I've accepted that. What needs to happen, I think, because it's not about, I don't think it's about, reliving or owning necessarily the sins of the father, at least right now. Like, that's been part of the discourse, I know. But I think it's just about owning what's happening right now, right? Like, there's so much being perpetuated. We could just isolate the summer of 2020, which was an awful time to live through, not just because of the pandemic, but because it seemed literally like every other day in this country. But then we started to see globally, like in Brazil and the UK, these assaults against Black lives. And so there really needs to be a reckoning with the participation in that, the hold that folks have on wanting to retain power, whether it's men wanting to retain power over women or white people wanting to retain power over non-white people. And that's a big project.
That's a huge project. And the irony is that some at the front of this abuse are people who don't even know that they've already lost power, and very often economically, and they don't know who took it from them. And it wasn't anyone Black, and it wasn't anyone female. You have to look somewhere else. But
yes.
Instead, they direct it toward,
Yeah, there's a lot of projection. And so in that Los Angeles Review of Books essay that I mentioned at the beginning, it's called Don't Hurt Yourself, Anti-Racism and White Self-Harm. Yeah. That's one of my points, is that as much as we can look at the victims of racism and all that stuff, but I think it's better to start with the sources, right? So we need to think about who's perpetrating that, right? Yeah. Like all the time, I'm trying to be aware of how am I contributing to the injustices, or how can I not contribute to the injustices done against women? Because as a man, I am part of this patriarchal structure in which we live and operate, and I'm aware of it, but I want no parts of perpetuating it. And it takes conscious, daily, for sure, awareness of that. And some people don't want to expend the energy that takes, because it takes a lot.
Yeah, I guess I should enter at this point that when I moved to Japan with my family in the mid 90s in search of a better job, I immigrated. It was just, I was working poor in the States. It was, yeah, and
I didn't realize you've been there so long.
I've been here a long time, and we had a 4-year-old, and my wife then was pregnant, and we got on an airplane from San Francisco. We flew to San Francisco, but we went out to eat, and there was a Black guy on the street, and he was angry, and he was yelling about something. And I'm, I got a 4-year-old and his pregnant wife, and I'm going, oh, come on, guy, ease off of it, damn it. And I was just irritated. And we got to Hiroshima, Japan. I didn't know a word of Japanese when I came here, 25 years ago, more than that, and have learned it in the interim. But I would say probably 6 months later, I was that guy. Mm-hmm. I got it, because as kind and wonderful as almost everybody was to us, you were still othered, there are not many of you. You are in a minority, nothing close to the experience of being Black in America historically and now. But you get a percentage, you get 1%, or I don't know, 7%, whatever. And you go, oh boy, do I get it now. Now I know why that guy is still pissed off about things and irritated, and he just came unhinged. And it's subtle things, like the woman who lived in our building, who every time I walked in the elevator and she was already in there, maybe 3 or 4 times this happened, she would jump, because she just wasn't used to seeing gaijin or a foreign national. And so I would walk in, and I'm a relatively big guy, and I would walk in and she'd go, ah, and then for 8 floors all the way up, she would apologize for, and I'm going, I didn't mind. I understood that I scared her. I'm not part of her accustomed world, things that we see that we're not accustomed to. But the apology was a bit irritating. And I've seen it with some foreign nationals here really get under their skin, and kind of drive them a little bit in the direction of Othello, not full on, but and you figure out ways to mediate it. And
yeah, because I think and that was something that came up during our Untitled Othello process. Actually, there was a white man in the room who talked about how he has felt othered at times, because he was in the minority. But one of the things that was interesting, I believe it was Sarah, she stepped in to acknowledge, and I don't know a whole lot about the dynamics of Japan, but if there's someone in Japan who has an general understanding of how whiteness operates in the world, right, then that's also something she's responding to. Yeah. And so it's not necessarily, it could be that you are, because you're in the minority, that you're sort of in the minority, but even so, whiteness carries so much power, both spoken and unspoken. And that was one of the topics that we talked about last week, is one of the things that I have to grapple with in even my forthcoming work, because Keith Hamilton Cobb's American Moor, or there's a really brilliant play by a young Australian Thai playwright, Anchuli Felicia King, called Keen. And in that play, she's also allowing us to sort of grapple with the power of whiteness. The play is set at a 3-day Shakespeare conference, and there are only 2 people of color at this conference, so everyone else is white, and it's mind-blowing how she's able to get us to think about how whiteness operates, both the spoken and unspoken power, and what it means to be marginalized or othered in that particular kind of space. So yeah, I've never been to Japan. I hope we see you here at some time in the not so distant future. Yes, when the pandemic ends, and invite me to this university at which you are.
Yes, and well, I have a couple of colleagues who do race and American Lit, and I'm going to make sure I'm going to give them homework. One of them cannot wait to see to hear what you had to say, and she's traveled extensively through the South with some. She's friends with Cornell and Cornell West, and brought him here to speak at our university about 10 years ago. Yeah,
I got to see him speak. Now I'm having one of those moments where I'm like, oh, I'm older. I'm not saying old. When I was, I believe, a sophomore in college, he came to Trinity College in Hartford, and because one of my professors there invited him, and wow, that was amazing.
He's just truly something, and such a kind and such a magnanimous person. You just don't expect him to behave. When you meet him personally, he's just your friend immediately. Well,
funny you say that, because that was I'm pretty sure I think it was 2017 when my parents came to Arizona, and we had this event, and then one of my colleagues actually hosted Bell Hooks at her house. So it wasn't like we were in an auditorium where I could just say, oh, okay, Bell Hooks over there at a distance, like I'm just going to admire her. We actually got to take a picture with her. We got to talk with her. And I think the same thing happened, where I was so nervous because she's Bell Hooks, but she didn't carry her so warm, so down to earth, so inviting, and made me realize what exactly humility and grace look like.
Yeah, humility and grace. Yeah, there's a little bit more of that in the world, and we're making progress. Well, I want to make it very clear that yes, there's power in whiteness, even in Japan, because there are other types of foreign nationals, and also there's power in being American. If things really start really going south, it's very good to be an American here. You don't, if you're from the Philippines or if you're from India or whatnot, and no way can it be compared. And I've heard people try to do it, and I just scoff at it. In no way can it be compared. No one has ever offered. I never, not ever once on the street pass a cop and think that this guy might shoot me if things go wrong in his mind, right? Yeah. Or driving a car and think I just got pulled because I'm the other person, right? No. It's usually, if there's anything, and I have been refused entrance in restaurants, but it's very rare and usually kind of outside of the main you're off the beating path. So I have had that experience. That's interesting. And I do remember having the feeling when I was younger, and this did happen, and this was in Hiroshima, there was something kind of that went haywire in my lizard brain or at the base of my spine or something. But I immediately sparked, and I was angry at the guy, and I let him have it, in a lot of English that he probably didn't understand. But when I got back, the people were with me and said, "Listen, you kind of lit your fuse, didn't he?" And I said, "Yeah." But that's how visceral this sort of thing is. I don't think that people understand until it happens to them just how infuriating it is. But that's too mild a word. It was just like this instant thing, like something else was taking control. Now I'm relating this to Othello, right? So something else takes control, just all of a sudden the history of who you are, maybe somehow even imprinted in DNA and somehow, but when that suspicion and fear and things start to unravel, how quickly and you can just fall to all is chaos. I remember he used when she's not there, right? It's all chaos.
Yeah, and I think because actually as you were talking, I was thinking about those words, and I mean, this is a scenario in which I wasn't there, so I can't speak to it directly, but there are moments, unfortunately, but again, we think about, and actually you see this, and I think Keith Hamilton Cobb's play, American Moor, but also in Untruly Felicia King's Keene, that there is this trauma response that's happening for her Black character, for instance, in relationship to the many white characters, or there's this fear, or maybe even PTSD is being triggered.
Something like that.
I have certainly had that happen for myself. And so it's hard to know without actually engaging the person, like, what is the motivation behind the response that you are getting as somebody who exists in like the broader world, whether it's me as a man walking into a room that's full of women, or you as a white man walking into a room full of people of color or Black people or whatever it might be. What's the motivation for the response and what's the experience? And so that's one of the things that I found fascinating again about last week was, as we talked more and more and got into week 2, people were starting to divulge things about their experiences, and also realizing how even when they thought they were on the receiving end of something, it might not necessarily have been that, So it was really, right. It was eye-opening for everybody.
Yeah, and it's a lot to sort. There's a lot, because you don't just have the people. Everybody walks in there with histories, and yes. Not just Black and white, but their own histories within and across, because I know you went to college at Trinity, which is hardly historically Black college, and a very fine college in Connecticut. Yeah. And so there are these crossings that happen too in our histories, where we have to meet various and sundry people. But before we got to I could go forever on this topic. I really could.
I know there's so much more I want to share before we end our time.
Yeah, but I can see why it went for so long. What you guys were doing, and I'm using guys as a non-gendered term. I'm told by my expert next door on using sensitive language that guys are okay for, all right, but there are people who will argue that. And yes, I didn't want to say folks. That's the only other word I can think about when you want to talk about a group of people.
I use folks. I like
folks is okay, isn't it?
Well, because it's, to me, I mean, that's my roots again. Like Southern, so for me, I'm like folks and folk and y'all.
Nobody I know of would be bothered with folks, but anyhow, why it was so intense. And by the way, that's another issue. I just contacted a friend of mine who's a trans woman, and I have a student writing a paper, and I had to check to see if you can still use the word drag, and I'm using it now because you can. I got
Yes.
it from
Oh,
I got
yeah,
it
you
from the source, and she's the author of a book coming out of Oxford UP on this subject. So I figured I had a good authority. So drag and drag queen you can still use. It's
Oh
just,
yes, I mean RuPaul's Drag Race. I'm a huge fan, and just of drag queens in general. So
yeah.
it's a
Oh, there's
world.
so much there. There's so much there culturally, isn't there?
Oh well, yeah, and I mean, there's so much in terms of even just the connection to what was, or who rather, was on the stage in Shakespeare's day, right? Because women
Yes.
were not allowed to act, and so Juliet was played by a boy actor, and Desdemona by a boy actor, and you've got men and males playing all these roles. So
Yeah.
that's, I mean, we could have a session on that
Oh,
alone.
we could. We could, where you have and my student is working on 12th Night, where you have a man cross-dressing as a woman who cross-dresses as a man, actually a young boy. And are you really cross-dressing or are you not at some point? It's just fun. It's fun to play with a bit. But I wanted to get out there and make sure that our viewer listeners know that you are an extraordinarily busy man working on all kinds of things here. As an editor, you are on advisory boards. I wanted to make sure to mention that, yes, you are on the advisory board of the Shakespeare Bulletin and also of the Shakespeare, let me not get this wrong here,
Shakespeare survey.
Survey. That's right. Shakespeare survey. There's several Shakespeare journals out there, but you are active as an editor there. And
or editorial. I'm an editorial board member. Yes.
An editorial board member. And you are involved with a bulletin special edition or special issue on social justice in contemporary performance.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about social justice in contemporary performance for just a bit.
Oh, big topic. I mean, it's, we've come a long way. There's still a long way to go. And this issue will be out in early next year, 2022. I'm super excited. I co-edited it with Sandra Young of University of Cape Town. And we've got work in there that deals with trans studies, disability studies, whiteness studies, Blackness studies or Black studies and more. And it is important to me that this issue is coming out because, last year we had well, at least in this country, but I think around the world, there was this sense that there was this racial reckoning happening and that people were paying more attention to the kinds of issues that need to matter and do matter. But then I don't know if it's been pandemic fatigue or whatever it might be. There's been some waning in people actually caring about particular matters. And so this issue is going to be released, and it's going to be an opportunity for folks to engage more with those matters. I have a piece in there actually on Anchuli Felicia King's play Keen, and there I'm dealing with whiteness head on. She actually defines whiteness in the play as her words in the play. It's a 3-day Shakespeare conference. If one had to define whiteness, it would be a 3-day Shakespeare conference.
Just take a snapshot, yeah.
You had the right response, because when I first got the script and I read it, I was like, holy crap, that is funny. But then the Red Bull Theater in New York City had a reading of it in 2020. It was hilarious because it's the satirical play that is both indicting racialized whiteness, but also getting people to understand why racism and the perpetuation of anti-Blackness is everyone's problem to deal with. And so, and it's a really, really funny play. It's so well done, and it creates rather, I should say, community, as Anchuli Felicia King said to me, because of the way, and community, I mean, in terms of the audience, it creates community among audience members because of the way that it does what it does in terms of race, which is really fascinating. So I hope people will check out that special issue if they have access to it. And if not, they can message me on Twitter and I will, at _ the brown print _ and I will gladly
put
provide
that. And also Shakespeare Studies Forum senior editor, and you have done a seminar a plenary seminar on Shakespeare's other race plays.
Yes, so I did a plenary talk in 2019, and then in 2020 I did 2 virtual seminars because pandemic. Just looking at plays that aren't grouped among the Othellos, Antony and Cleopatras, Merchant of Venice, The Tempest, and what's the 5th one I'm forgetting? Titus. How can I forget Titus?
Titus. It was too close.
Yeah, I'm like, how could I forget Titus? But yeah, so I had upwards of 20 people between the 2 seminars, and then respondents, Jeannie Howard, Ruben Espinosa, Arthur Little Jr., and Patricia Akimi, and for the 2 seminars, and the contributors all submitted work that was dealing with plays outside of those 5 plays that I just mentioned. And then we ended up turning some of that work into essays for the 50th, which is very exciting. It's going to be the 50th volume of Shakespeare Studies. So next year, 2022 is an anniversary year for Shakespeare Studies. And there will be, I think we have 9 contributions to the forum, discussing, again, a range of topics, but oscillating around the general topic of whiteness.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Now, you have worked with the Folger Shakespeare Library as a friend of the podcast. I've been a reader for years. It's just a delightful experience of that institution and being able to use their resources, but the people you meet. So you worked with them and on teaching race every place.
Mm-hmm.
And also, there's something to do with humanities in Texas and Folger education, Reconstruction. So you've done a lot of work with the Folger, and so I'm happy to hear that. They sponsor so much research. It's not
They
sponsored.
do, and they were even actually they were sponsors of Untitled Othello as well. And
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Okay.
they offered financial support for Untitled Othello, which was amazing, and we were so grateful for that. And actually, my relationship with the Folger started really in 2016 when they did their traveling Folio exhibition. And the Folio came to the University of Arizona, and then my colleagues and I, they were responsible for putting together a grant to, we taught a course together, and it was all centered around the Folio coming to the University of Arizona. And that was really great because the Folger, in addition to, I believe it was the Mellon Foundation, or no, NEH rather, it was NEH, provided this fellowship to help us create, or grant rather, to help us create a course. So it was really, really awesome. Yeah.
Oh. Well, I can't imagine this, and you can't really talk about it because these books have not been published, but you have 2, not 1, but 2 book projects in the works. I'm imagining that having to do with, what we've been talking about. And I'm thinking timeline. Are you getting close to the end of at least one of them, or?
One is fully drafted, and I hope to God I am at the end with this thing. And then the other one is under advanced contract with a major university press. And so I'm excited because that's what I'm going to be spending my beginning of the next year doing, is churning that thing out. I can say that, yes, both deal with engaging racialized whiteness. One is a pedagogy book. Because teaching is something that I love. So within my, love teaching.
Yeah, that's a good combination. So pedagogy along with scholarship, you run the,
Well, and for me, my pedagogy and scholarship are inseparable. So there's this synergy between them. They inform each other. And so because if you look at my sort of publication record thus far, like it's pedagogy pieces, whether it's articles or essays, and also then the more sort of strict research articles. But my pedagogy scholarship requires research. So, and they inform each other. So
that's the way it should be. And that's the way it is with you. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, my students are they're great collaborators.
Excellent. Well, I wanted to kind of move through. There's a lot of stuff here. We won't be able to do it all, but there's you've done a little bit of digital work, digital humanities type work on the sonic color line.
Yes.
What is the sonic color line? That's
So, oh gosh, I wish I had that book next to me. I don't, but the sonic color line. So I have a brilliant colleague at Binghamton University, Jennifer Stover, who wrote a book called The Sonic Color Line, Race and the Cultural Politics of Listening. And she's building on the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. And actually, Jennifer Stover is going to be part of my work with TRII, the symposium that we talked about at the beginning. And the sonic color line, in a nutshell, Stover is thinking about how we not only see race, but we hear race. And so actually, I love the split screen that I'm seeing on my end here with you and I. So we have a white man and a black man, and what it means for the audience to think about the sound of my voice versus the sound of your voice, and what our listening ears, not just as these sort of parts of our bodies, but really as these critical sort of apparatuses that allow us to process race, right? Yeah. So
auditory,
I'll just leave that.
Auditory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll leave that there for your audience.
Yeah, I've been working, or I've interviewed someone who has worked with auditory specialists. But while I have you here, yes, Black Klansman. What's the review? Is that the movie? I just saw the movie because
I haven't seen it.
You haven't seen it? Okay.
No.
Ping me after you do, and just thumbs up or down. I loved it. I loved it. I mean, it had, but maybe I'm loving it for the wrong reasons.
Okay. Yeah, I have not seen it. But I have nothing to say.
I think it could be the best thing Spike Lee's done. But and it was just so brilliantly acted. But you may know that the plot is about a black cop in Colorado who learned to speak white, and he fooled the Klan over the phone and duped them in the movie. So it's kind of a fun plot like that.
Well, that sounds to me, because I haven't seen it yet, but now I've got the pandemic is just, I don't know, what is time? I don't even know where I'm at.
What is time? Yeah.
But that sounds to me a lot like, so Jennifer Stover, actually, in my Binghamton College, Jennifer Stover and I, we did a Folger Library Critical Race conversation last year, and we talked about the sound of whiteness, and that's available on the Folger's YouTube page. But the reason I mention it is because we had a moment during our intermission where we played a clip from the Boots Riley film, Sorry to Bother You, which is all about this black character using his white voice that allows him to make more money at his job, because he's like, he works in like a call center. So there's a connection there. So now I definitely have to look at Black Klansman, if not for the reason.
And it features Denzel Washington's son.
Okay.
Who was a pro athlete for a while and is a superb actor. It's I thought it was a lot of fun. But if you respond differently, I want to know.
I've got to write this down, because I'm about to shut down. Actually, today is the last day of me doing anything related to Shakespeare stuff. I'm shutting down for like several weeks. And so Black Klansman is going to be on my list of things to watch.
Well, we promised our audience that we would get back to hood feminism.
And, yes.
This was a very, it's in a scholarly journal, but it was the most top 5 read article in the history of the journal from the journal Literature Compass. And this is on whiteness and, oh, come on, David, segregated pre-modern scholarly discourse in the post-racial era. Now, I wasn't good at math. You have to turn on my head here.
I'm like, oh God, that sounds like jargon. I can break that down really quickly. So post-racial era is just referring to, when Obama became president, everybody was like, oh, we live in the post-racial era, race is over, and there's no more racism. And it's like, yeah, right. So post-racial era just refers to that. Pre-modern scholarly discourse is just thinking about, Shakespeare's time. So 16th, 17th century. And essentially what I'm breaking down in the article is how within the field of early modern studies, there's been this sort of disconnect between the work that pre-modern critical race studies scholars do and isolating the work of those who do domestic criticism in the field, so focusing on the household, the family, et cetera, and how there hasn't been over the past several decades a lot of contact between the two, when in fact race really informs a lot of what's going on within the household. And one of the things that I point out in the article is how race scholars have been more willing to sort of venture into the domestic realm, whereas scholars who do the domestic work have not so much engaged with race as robustly as they could. And therein lies the segregation. And this is not just in that area of the field, it's in other areas of the field. And so I, position this article, the very first words are, this is a call to action. And it's a call to action for scholars in all different fields to think about citational practices, to think about, who are they citing? Who are they not citing? Are they only citing white folks? Are they only citing men? Really being conscientious about all of that stuff matters. And so that's one of the points of this article, in addition to just thinking about Black feminism. So again, you think about someone like Bell Hooks, or we can get present day Mickey Kendall, whose work I draw on specifically. She has a book called Hood Feminism, so I'm borrowing from her title, and everyone in between. So yeah, that's that piece in a nutshell, but it was my favorite probably of what I did last year. Yeah.
Well, that brings us to, and I kind of want to move toward closing with this, that you, along with Shakespeare, you look into the household as a field of study or subfield, and also mental health. And my mother was a psychiatric social worker in her career. And so we were a big mental health family. Not that we were always mentally healthy, but there was a standard there. And we had I had the joy of having the enlightenment of that you're not weak if you're sad, that I'm a man in the South. It's okay for men to cry. It's okay to be. We had that as just part of the of my mother's profession, but many people didn't. It surprised me in the PTSD period after the Iraq War started, and all of these wars, how still it didn't seem that the military had, and people in the military had accepted that trauma does things to you.
Yes.
Keeps on, it doesn't go away, and left untreated, you're in big trouble. But particularly men want, they're tough. Everybody's John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, or whatnot. And how that still is part of military consciousness. And so you work on both mental health and the household.
Yes. And I'm just thinking, because I'm like, how do I boil this one down? It's so much to say about it. I started to care a lot about mental health when I realized that I had my own challenges of my own. Struggling with anxiety, for instance. And it is important to me because, one, as a Shakespearean, I realized that the literature allows us to have these discussions, right? It facilitates it, which I thought, oh my gosh. So I can talk to my students about, as you say, PTSD you mentioned, and domestic violence and the effects of trauma and all of that. Really important. Or we can, one of the reasons why I teach Titus, not one of the reasons why I necessarily love the play, is that it allows us to talk about sexual violence as well. And so I have a piece in the Sundial where I think specifically, and that's a public journal, a publicly accessible journal run out of the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, where I talk about sexual violence and get into the specifics of the effects of that. It leads to PTSD, it leads to certain type of trauma responses. It can also lead folks down the road of addiction, which then becomes its own mental health issue and abuse issue that needs to be dealt with. I also think in the Los Angeles Review of Books essay, the Don't Hurt Yourself piece, again, about the psychological, emotional, physical toll that racism takes on the people who perpetuate it. There's a great article that I cite in the very beginning of it that actually lists, the author lists the many different ways how racism harms the white people who perpetuate it and everyone in between. So it's...
all are punished, to quote the prince in Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah, all are punished. And if we take that seriously, it makes you pause when you maybe want to be, because you haven't dealt with your own mental health stuff, right? So you, instead of, because there are these in different areas of this conversation, there is something called the victim to perpetrator cycle. And so when you have not dealt with your issues, particularly, let's say somebody who's been sexually abused as a child, there's research that's been done that suggests they are more likely to become an abuser because that is their way of coping with their abuse. Yeah. And I think we need to stop and we need to slow down and we need to pause and we need to have these conversations. So when I teach Titus, which I always teach Titus, I don't let my students get away with ignoring Act 2, Scene 4, and the aftermath of what happens to Lavinia when she's been raped and mutilated by Chiron and Demetrius. When I taught this class at Trinity College, I actually had the director of the Women Gender Resource Action Center come in to the classroom and provide students with statistics to facilitate a conversation about gender stereotypes, but also the intersection of gendered and racialized stereotypes, and what that means for students. Because a lot of students were under the impression that males are not victims of sexual violence. And while we aren't at the rate at which women are, there are men and boys who get sexually abused all the time. It's not talked about as much, and it needs to be, because that's oftentimes, or not oftentimes, but that's sometimes why you'll meet somebody who, a male in particular, like the stereotype, right? Guys are supposed to be tough and strong. And if you are somebody who has been sexually abused as a child, a male in particular, you might start overcompensating for that and develop this incredibly tough and strong exterior in the gay world, which I'm a member of the LGBTQ community, and I am someone who identifies as gay. There's a lot of trauma that people deal with and try to overcompensate for because maybe they were bullied as a kid and considered effeminate or not masculine enough. And so, and it's just like, you gotta recognize what trauma does and then start the healing process. So I love to talk about I tweet about mental health every week. I'm tweeting, if not every other day, I'm tweeting about mental health because we're living in a pandemic right now.
Oh my. David, I have a class coming up, so I want to bring things to a close from now, but we leave this open-ended and try to wring from you a commitment somewhere in the future to return either to this series, if it's still going, or come to Japan and visit us here. But I wanted to express my appreciation, but also I'm funded by the Japanese taxpayers, and we're my colleagues and my students here at our university, our listeners that we kind of picked up a few along the way, also my friends at in the Shakespeare Society of Japan, and also my friends in literary studies and all over literature and the humanities and so forth. Extend our gratitude and our thanks to you for joining us here today. It was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.